The wind in Ash Mesa never asked permission. It came down from the high red rock, dry and sharp, tasting of grit and distance. It scoured the paint from the sign of the Silver Lark Saloon, and it made the newly strung barbed wire along the edge of town keen a low, mournful note. The sagebrush, silver green and weary, bent before it, their branches sweeping the dusty ground like the hair of a woman who had finally given up. It was a wind that promised nothing but more of itself. In this year of 1886, Ash Mesa was a town caught between a whisper and a shout. The whisper was the old life, the slow turning of seasons and the quiet struggle for water. The shout was the railroad, a raw gash of iron and splintered timber that had arrived 3 months ago. Its sound was the clang of a hammer from the new depot, a relentless beat that struck the hot air like a man driving nails into his own coffin. Between the raw lumber of the depot and the weathered gray wood of Reverend Santos's church, the town held its breath. Lila Bennett did not hold her breath. She breathed in the familiar air of the Silver Lark, a mix of stale whiskey, sawdust, and the clean, earthy scent of the leather and glue she kept at her small corner desk. At 28, her world had been pared down to essentials. The debt was essential. It was a shadow left by her father's typhoid fever and the doctor bills that followed. Her work was essential. By day, she kept the books for Ruby May, the owner of the saloon. Her handwriting was a thing of stark clarity in a world of smudges and lies. By night, in the quiet of her rented room, she was a bookbinder. She mended spines, stitched pages, and gave new life to things that were falling apart. It was a quiet craft, and it was hers alone. There had been other things in her life. There had been a father whose laugh was warmer than the winter sun. There had been a fiancé, a young man named Thomas, whose future had been as bright and loud as the dynamite he used to blast a path for the railroad. Until one day, the blast had been too bright, too loud, and had taken him with it. Now, her single and driving purpose was to pay what was owed and build a small life that did not have to lean on anyone. A life as straight and true as a well-stitched seam. The swing doors of the Silver Lark pushed inward, letting in a slice of glaring afternoon and a man who seemed to carry the silence of the plains with him. This was Sheriff Jonah Hale. He was not a large man, but he filled a space larger than his frame. He moved with a stillness that made other men feel clumsy. He said little, and when he did, his voice was a low rasp, a remnant of a wound that had long since scarred over but still pulled at his vocal cords. The sound was strange, a mix of cold iron and unexpected warmth. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. Men said he was fast with his gun, but no one had ever seen him prove it without cause. He did not wear his reputation like a badge. He carried it like a tool he hoped not to use. He did not come to Lila's desk. He went to the bar where Ruby May was polishing a glass with a steady, circular motion. Ruby May was a woman whose beauty had hardened into a kind of handsome resilience. She had a sharp tongue and a soft heart, a dangerous combination in a town like Ash Mesa. "Sheriff," she said, her voice even. "This is an odd time for you." Jonah Hale took off his hat and ran a hand through his dust-colored hair. "Any trouble?" "Ruby May. The only trouble here is the price of good whiskey and the quality of bad men, and neither is new." He nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping the room. It touched on the 2 men playing cards, the old prospector nursing a beer, and then, for a moment, it rested on Lila. "Have you seen any new men around railroad workers?" "Maybe, looking for a different kind of work." Ruby May shrugged. "Men drift in, they drift out, they drink their pay, and I do not ask for a life story." 2 men from the tie-laying crew are gone," he said, "vanished 2 nights ago. No word." Lila kept her eyes on the ledger in front of her. The names in it were a catalog of hope and desperation, credit extended for a week, a debt paid in jerky. She heard the scrape of a chair and knew, without looking, that Pike Crowder and Cully Finch had entered the saloon. They were Silas Vane's men, Vane was the man getting rich off the railroad. He owned the biggest cattle ranch, the warehouse by the depot, and, increasingly, he owned the men who lived here. Pike Crowder was a thick slab of a man who smiled with his mouth but not his eyes, showing a flash of gold tooth. Cully Finch was his opposite, thin, neat, with spectacles perched on his nose and hands that were always clean. Pike was the fist. Cully was the fine print. Together, they were the engine of Silas Vane's ambition to swallow every piece of land that touched the river. They walked past the sheriff with a nod that was almost a sneer. Pike's spurs made a belligerent jingle on the floorboards. Lila hated the fine print most of all. She had seen one of Vane's contracts, a document called a dry season mortgage. A rancher, desperate after a rainless summer, had shown it to her. The language was a tangle of thorns, a trap of words that promised a loan but delivered foreclosure. Reading it, Lila had smelled the same rotten odor that came from soured ink. It was the smell of a lie. She knew the railroad was supposed to be progress, but all she could see was the way its shadow fell over the small lives in its path, extinguishing them one by one. Sheriff Hale's gaze had moved back to her. "Miss Bennett, you handle the accounts. Have any of the railroad men settled up a large tab recently? As if they were leaving for good." Lila looked up. Her eyes met his. For a long moment, the noise of the saloon faded. She saw the weariness in his face, the steady resolve that lay beneath it. She could have told him things. She could have told him about the whispers she heard, about men offered cash to work in a silver mine somewhere in the hills, a place called Dead Bride Gulch. But to speak was to draw attention, and attention was a currency she could not afford to spend. "Men come and go," she said, her voice flat. "I just tally the whiskey they drink before they do." Her answer was a dismissal, a closing door, but her eyes held his for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary. In that sliver of time, something passed between them. It was not agreement, not alliance. It was a simple, stark acknowledgement of the truth of this place, that justice was a fragile thing, as easily torn as a cheap page. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He put his hat back on and turned, walking out into the relentless sun as quietly as he had entered. Pike Crowder slid onto the stool the sheriff had vacated. He leaned his thick arms on the bar and grinned at Ruby May. "Get me a beer, woman. And tell your little bookkeeper not to stare so hard at the law. It's bad for her health." Lila looked down at her ledger, dipping her pen in the inkwell. The ink was a deep, honest black. Beside her, on a small stack of finished work, lay a copy of a poetry book. Its cover was plain brown leather, but she had stitched the binding with a thread of brilliant, defiant red. It was a thin thread, but it was strong. It held the pages together against the forces that would tear them apart. Outside, the wind gusted, rattling the windows and sending a fine dusting of ash-colored soil under the door. It whispered of a storm, one that had been gathering for a long time and was now, finally, about to break. 3 days later, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the roofs of Ash Mesa until the very air seemed to shimmer and warp. A freight wagon, its canvas cover bleached pale by the sun, rumbled to a stop in front of the Silver Lark. The driver, a man with a face like a dried apple, jumped down and wrestled a small, heavy wooden crate from the back. He grunted as he hauled it onto the boardwalk. "Printing supplies," he wheezed, wiping a sleeve across his forehead. "For the station, but the clerk is at lunch, and I am not paid to wait." He gestured at Lila, who was sweeping the dust from the entrance. "You look like you can read. Sign here." Lila took the offered paper and pencil. The crate was stenciled with the words Ash Mesa Depot, but underneath, in smaller letters, it said Vane Warehouse, and below that, printing supplies. Her curiosity, a thing she usually kept on a tight leash, stirred. She signed her name, Lila Bennett, in her clear, precise hand. The driver grunted his thanks, climbed back onto his wagon, and was gone in a cloud of dust. She pushed the crate inside, the wood scraping against the floorboards. It was heavier than paper and ink ought to be. Ruby May was in the back, counting inventory. The saloon was empty, caught in the midday lull. Lila looked at the crate. Printing supplies were her trade, her art. The temptation was a small, insistent itch. A mistake had been made. The crate was not hers, but it was here. Using the flat end of a fireplace poker, she pried at the lid. The nails groaned and gave way. Inside, there was no paper, no ink, no lead type. There was a thick, leather-bound ledger, a cash box, and several smaller notebooks. The air suddenly felt colder. Her hands, moving as if of their own accord, lifted the main ledger. It was not a book of accounts for a warehouse. It was a field journal, filled with entries in Cully Finch's meticulous script. Names of men, mostly Irish and Chinese, followed by sums of money and dates. And beside many of the names, a chillingly simple mark, a capital X, stark and final. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She flipped through the pages. She saw the name of one of the men Sheriff Hale had mentioned, the one who had vanished from the tie-laying crew. And beside his name, a notation to contract fulfilled. DBG, Dead Bride Gulch. This was not a record of supplies. It was a record of men, bought and sold like cattle. Silas Vane was not just squeezing ranchers off their land. He was hunting men, trapping them in contracts written in invisible ink, and shipping them to a silver mine from which it seemed they never returned. Panic rose in her throat, hot and sharp. She should nail the lid shut and drag the crate to the depot immediately. She should forget what she had seen. This was Silas Vane's business. This was the kind of filth that swallowed people whole. But then she thought of Thomas, blown apart for the sake of the railroad's progress. She thought of her father, worn down by a life of hard work with nothing to show for it but a pile of debt. Her gaze fell on her own small work bag, sitting on the corner of her desk. Inside was a notebook she had made for herself, bound in simple calfskin, but stitched with that same defiant red thread. It was where she kept her own accounts, her own plans, her own small hopes, acting on an impulse that was part fear and part fury. She pulled out the notebook and a pencil. Her hands trembled, but her purpose was steady. She opened the ledger again, to the list of names marked with an X, as quickly as she could, her pencil flying across the page. She copied the list. Then she turned to a page detailing payments from the Dead Bride Gulch mine to a holding company in Santa Fe, and she copied that. Two pages. 2 pages of poison. It felt like holding a snake. She finished, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She placed the ledger back in the crate, arranged everything as it had been, and hammered the lid back down with the poker. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet saloon. Then she dragged the crate back outside onto the boardwalk, leaving it in the shade. She walked, trying to keep her pace even, to the depot. The station master was back from his lunch, complaining about the heat. "There is a crate for you," Lila said, her voice sounding foreign in her own ears. The freight driver left it at the saloon by mistake. He grumbled but sent a boy with a handcart to fetch it. Lila turned to leave, and as she did, she saw Sheriff Hale. He was standing beside a string of freight cars on a siding, his attention fixed on one in particular. It was an old box car, its paint peeling, its identifying numbers scraped and painted over. But near the door, carved into the wood as if with a knife, were 3 characters DB7. She stopped. The air left her lungs. Her eyes met the sheriff's across the dusty expanse of the rail yard. He had seen it. She had seen it. His expression did not change, but she saw the understanding click into place behind his gray eyes, like the tumblers of a lock. For a half-second, the world seemed to shrink to the space between them, a space filled with a silent, terrible knowledge. Then, deliberately, Lila turned her head and walked back toward the silver lark, the sun hot on the back of her neck. They both knew, and they both knew the other knew. That evening, the saloon was busier. Pike Crowder came in, not for a drink, but with a purpose. He walked directly to Lila's corner desk. She kept her eyes on her work, the familiar columns of figures, a fragile shield. He stopped beside her, so close she could smell the sour odor of whiskey on his breath. He did not speak. He simply reached out and placed his large, scarred hand on the curved wooden back of her chair, right behind her shoulders. The gesture was casual, almost gentle, but it was a cage. His thumb rested inches from her neck. "I hear you have taken an interest in the freight business. Miss Bennett," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I signed for a crate that was delivered here by mistake. That is all." "Just be careful," he continued, his thumb making a small, slow circle on the wood. "It is not healthy to read other people's books. Sometimes they have unhappy endings." Lila's blood ran cold. She sat frozen, the pen clutched in her hand. "That chair belongs to the town, not you." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the saloon like a razor. Jonah Hale stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Pike's hand tightened on the chair for a moment. Then he slowly withdrew it. He turned, a smirk twisting his lips. "Just making conversation with the lady. Sheriff." Jonah's gaze did not waver. "Find someone else to talk to." Pike hesitated, his bulk seeming to swell as he considered a challenge. But something in the sheriff's stillness, in the absolute certainty of his stance, made him reconsider. He gave a short, ugly laugh and swaggered back to the bar. Jonah Hale looked at Lila. He gave a single, curt nod, then turned and left as silently as he had come. Later that night, in the solitude of her room, Lila sat with her red-stitched notebook open on the small table. The 2 pages of copied names and figures seemed to writhe on the paper. She wanted to burn them. She wanted to throw the notebook into a well and go back to a life measured in ink and thread and the slow, steady reduction of a debt. But she could not. The names were real. The men were real. Her safety was a small, selfish thing compared to their lives. Her conscience gnawed at her, a relentless pain. She traced the red thread on the notebook's spine with her finger. It was the color of courage, the color of blood. The next morning, the spark landed on the kindling. 2 of the sheriff's deputies walked into the Silver Lark. They were polite but firm. They had a warrant for the arrest of Ruby May. "On what charge?" Lila demanded, standing up so quickly her chair scraped back. "Unpaid debts," the older deputy said, not meeting her eye. "Says here she owes Silas Vane's warehouse for 3 barrels of beer delivered last month."
"That is a lie,"
Ruby May said, her voice dangerously calm.
"I pay cash for every delivery. I have the receipts."
The deputy shrugged. "The judge signed the warrant. You will have to tell him." They led her out. The entire saloon watched in stunned silence. A few of Vane's men at a back table smirked into their glasses. Lila understood immediately. This was not about beer. This was a message. It was a demonstration of power. Silas Vane was showing the whole town what happened when you stood in his way, or even when you simply occupied a space he might one day want. But Lila knew it was more than that. It was a warning, aimed directly at her. Pike's threat had been the whisper. This was the shout. For an hour, Lila sat at her desk, her hands clenched in her lap. She could do nothing. She could retreat, let Ruby May face this alone, and pray that Vane would be satisfied. Safety was right there, a quiet, sensible path. But then she saw the faces of the men on the list she had copied. She saw Sheriff Hale standing in the rail yard, the grim knowledge in his eyes. She saw the red thread on her notebook. She stood up, put on her bonnet, and walked out of the saloon. The sun was high now, the street full of people who parted for her, their eyes filled with pity and curiosity. She did not look at them. She walked with a straight back and a steady step, all the way to the small clapboard building with the faded sign that read, "Sheriff." The door was open. Jonah Hale was sitting at his desk, staring at a stack of paperwork as if it were a puzzle he could not solve. He looked up as she entered, his face betraying no surprise. She did not say a word. She walked to his desk, took the red-stitched notebook from her bag, and opened it to the first of the 2 pages she had copied. She tore them out, the sound of the ripping paper loud in the small, quiet office. She laid the 2 sheets of paper flat on his desk. His eyes scanned the pages, taking in the names, the X's, the financial figures. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked up at her, his gray eyes searching her face.
I do not like trouble, Sheriff,
Lila said, her voice low but clear.
but I hate filth more.
He was silent for a long time, his gaze holding hers. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, risk, fear, and a fragile, burgeoning trust. He finally gave a slow nod. I will not put your name on any official report. Miss Bennett, he said, his voice that strange mix of gravel and warmth. I will not pull you into this, but you should know, if this all goes sideways, if it comes down to testimony, my name will come before yours. That is the best I can promise. It was enough. It was more than enough. Trust was not a word. It was a man standing between you and the thing you feared most. Lila turned and walked out of his office, back into the harsh, unforgiving light of Ash Mesa, feeling as though she had just struck a match in a room full of dynamite. Ruby May was released 2 days later. The official explanation, a clerical error. The real reason, a warning shot that had found its mark. She walked back into the Silver Lark with her chin held high, but there was a new hardness in her eyes. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, content to believe the matter was settled. Lila knew it was only a pause, the quiet intake of breath before a strike. The confrontation came not in the saloon's shadows, but in the open glare of the Saturday market. The street was a chaotic river of people, horses and wagons. Farmers sold corn and squash from the beds of their carts. A blacksmith hammered out a ringing rhythm, and the air was thick with the smells of dust, horse manure, and fresh-baked bread. Lila was examining a bolt of sturdy gray calico, thinking of a new dress, a small and practical luxury, when a voice cut through the noise, a voice like honey laced with ground glass.
Well, if it is not my little book mouse.
Lila turned. Maud Hart stood there, a vision of wealth and disdain. Years ago, they had been cousins who shared a room and whispered secrets in the dark. Now, Maud was Mrs. Silas Vane, his second wife, draped in dark green silk that must have cost more than Lila earned in 6 months. A fashionable little hat with a single, cruel-looking feather was perched on her perfectly coiffed hair. "Maud," Lila said, her voice even. "A proper lady would call me Mrs. Vane," Maud said, her smile not reaching her cold, assessing eyes. "But then, you were never one for being proper. Were you always with your nose in a book instead of learning how to manage a household?"
I manage my own household quite well, thank you.
"Oh, I am sure you do." Maud's voice dripped with false sympathy.
It must be so very simple.
A single room, a single plate, a single, empty life. A few nearby shoppers had stopped to listen, their face a mixture of curiosity and cruel enjoyment. Lila felt their eyes on her, sharp as needles. She wanted to turn and walk away, but that would be a victory for Maud.
My life is my own,
she said quietly. I am not in debt to any man. Maud let out a short, sharp laugh. That is because no man would have you, not anymore. Thomas is gone. Poor boy. And you, my dear cousin, you will never find love again. The words hung in the hot, dusty air. They were meant to wound, and they did. They struck the old, tender bruise of her grief for Thomas, the quiet ache of her loneliness. Maud leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. Because you only know how to stitch books.
Lila, you do not know how to stitch the hearts of men.
A few people snickered. A woman turned away, hiding a smirk behind her hand. The public humiliation was a hot brand on Lila's skin. She did not cry out or trade insults. She simply stood there, her back straight, her face a pale, still mask. She felt her hand, as if of its own accord, move to the simple cloth bag at her side. Her fingers pressed against the hard spine of the small notebook within, the one bound with red thread. The pain of Maud's words was a sharp, clarifying sting. It was salt rubbed into a wound. Yes, but it was also a fire that burned away fear, leaving only a hard, cold resolve. From across the street, standing in the shade of the land office awning, Sheriff Jonah Hale watched. He had heard every word. He saw the smirking faces in the crowd, the rigid set of Lila's shoulders, the way her hand sought the comfort of her bag. His first instinct was to stride across the street and put a stop to it, to use the weight of his office to silence Maud's venom. But he held himself back. To intervene would be to make a spectacle of her, to imply she was a woman who needed a man to fight her battles. She had a pride as straight and unbending as an iron rail, and he would not be the one to dent it. Maud, satisfied with the damage she had inflicted, gave a final, triumphant little smile and swept away, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. The small crowd dissolved, a little ashamed, a little entertained. Lila stood alone for a moment, the bolt of calico forgotten in her hands. She paid the merchant, her movement stiff, and then turned to go. As she stepped into the street, she passed the spot where Jonah was standing. He did not speak. He simply, and with a grave sort of courtesy, removed his hat and held it over his heart for the brief moment it took for her to walk by. It was a small gesture, one a man might make at a funeral, but in that moment, it was everything. It was a silent testament, a public acknowledgement of her dignity in the face of insult. It was a hand offered in the dark, and it kept her from stumbling. She did not want to go back to the Silver Lark. She did not want to see the pity or questions in Ruby May's eyes. Instead, she found herself walking toward the rail yard, seeking the indifferent silence of iron and steel. The place was mostly deserted, the work crews having moved farther down the line. She walked along the tracks, the sun beating down on the steel rails until they shimmered. The rhythmic crunch of her boots on the gravel was a soothing sound. She stopped beside a line of idle boxcars, their sides scarred with the graffiti of travel. It was then she heard it, a small sound, a soft scraping, from beneath the boxcar nearest her. She froze, her hand flying to her throat. A stray dog, perhaps, or a rat. But then the sound came again, followed by a faint, muffled sob. It was the sound of a child. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt down, peering into the deep, hot shadows under the carriage. At first, she saw nothing but wheels and greasy axles. Then, she saw him. A small boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, was huddled against a wheel, trying to make himself invisible. He was Chinese, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his black hair matted. He wore the simple pants and tunic of a laborer's son, and around his neck, on a piece of dirty string, hung a small, crudely carved wooden tag. She could see the letters carved into it, stark and clear. DB7. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same mark Jonah had seen on the freight car. This was not an abstract list of names anymore. This was a child. She spoke softly, her voice gentle. "It is all right. I will not hurt you." The boy flinched, pressing himself harder against the iron wheel. He stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. He whispered something, a torrent of panicked sounds in a language she did not understand. But in the middle of it, she caught 2 words she recognized, spoken with a child's clumsy accent. "Bad men, no go." He knew some English, and from the sound of the rest, she guessed he was speaking Cantonese. The railroad had brought hundreds of men from his country, men who worked harder and for less pay than anyone else, men whose names were now on a list in Jonah Hale's office. Lila made her decision in an instant. She could not leave him here. She could not take him to the sheriff's office. That would be too public. She had to hide him. "Come with me," she said, keeping her voice low and soothing. "I have a safe place. Food. Water." She held out her hand. He stared at it, his small body trembling. She did not move, did not rush him. She simply waited, her hand outstretched. After a long minute that seemed to stretch into an hour, he uncurled himself from the wheel and crept toward her. He placed his small, grimy hand in hers. It felt as fragile as a bird's wing. Getting him back to the Silver Lark without being seen was a challenge. She led him along the back of the buildings, staying in the alleys, her heart pounding with every distant footstep. They slipped through the back door of the saloon, into the storeroom. It was cool and dark, smelling of yeast and aging wood. Ruby May was there, stacking clean mugs. She looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of the boy. Lila put a finger to her lips. She explained in a torrent of low whispers what she had found, what the tag around his neck meant. Ruby May's face hardened. Her brief, unjust stay in the town jail had burned away any tolerance she might have had for Silas Vane and his operations.
"He can stay here,"
Ruby May said without hesitation.
"in my room upstairs. No one will find him there."
That evening, Lila sat at her corner desk, the familiar ledger open before her. But she saw none of the numbers. Her mind was in the room upstairs, with the silent, terrified boy. She had to tell Jonah. She had to do it now, before Vane's men realized one of their cargo was missing. Just before dusk, Sheriff Hale pushed through the saloon doors, just as she knew he would. It was his habit to take a cup of coffee and survey the town as the light failed. He did not look at her, but she felt his presence. A quiet weight in the room. He ordered his coffee from the barman and stood leaning against the counter, his back to her. Lila picked up her pen. Her hand was steady, on the wooden surface of her desk, hidden from the rest of the room by the ledger. She began to tap, a slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 soft taps, a pause, 7 soft taps. She repeated the pattern twice. She saw his shoulders tense. He did not turn, but she knew he had heard. He finished his coffee in 2 swallows, placed the cup on the bar, and walked out. A few minutes later, there was a quiet knock on the storeroom door. It was Jonah. Lila led him up the back stairs to Ruby May's room. The boy was asleep on a small cot, curled into a tight ball. The wooden tag was lying on his chest, rising and falling with each breath. It looked like a pendulum, counting down the seconds to a confrontation. Jonah looked at the boy, then at the tag, his face grim in the lamplight. "So this is what they are shipping," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Not just men, children." Lila nodded, her throat too tight for words. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a deep and weary sorrow. He seemed about to say something, then stopped. He ran a hand over his face. "I was part of a posse once," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Up near Red Cliff. We were hunting a gang of rustlers. We had a tip they were holed up in a ranch house. We were sure, so we went in fast, at night, guns blazing." He paused, the memory twisting his face. "We were wrong. It was the wrong ranch. It was just a family. Homesteaders. Good people. They died because we were fast instead of smart." He looked at Lila, and in his eyes, she saw the ghost of a younger man. A man who had not yet learned that justice and haste were mortal enemies. "I do not make that mistake again," he said. "We will get them, Miss Bennett, but we will do it my way. Slow, careful, and certain." Lila looked from his haunted face to the sleeping child on the bed. Maud's words from the morning echoed in her mind. "You will never find love again." The words still stung, a cruel and personal dart. But as she stood there in the quiet room, sharing a dangerous secret with this quiet, wounded man, she realized Maud was wrong. The words of a bitter woman were just wind. This, however, this shared duty to protect an innocent child, This was real. This was a thread of a different kind, stronger than any simple stitch, and it was beginning to bind them together. The plan was born from a shared silence between Jonah and old Wapiti, the old Arapaho hunter whose face was a map of the land itself. Wapiti had known this country before the fences, before the railroad, before the name Ash Mesa was ever spoken. He moved through the sagebrush with no more sound than a passing shadow. Jonah trusted his eyes and his silence more than any posse. The new freight schedules, which Lila had procured, showed an unscheduled stop 3 nights from now, a boxcar left on a siding by the river bend, a place where the cottonwoods grew thick and the banks were steep. They went on foot under a sliver of moon that gave just enough light to see the treachery of the ground, but not enough to betray them. Lila insisted on coming. "This is my fight, too," she had said, her voice quiet but unbending. "I am not a fragile thing to be hidden away while men do the work." Jonah had looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, and had seen the same steel he carried in himself. He had simply nodded. The air by the river was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The chirping of frogs was a thin, high sound, like 1,000 tiny needles stitching the darkness. The barbs on a new fence line, strung low to the ground, snagged the hem of Lila's skirt with a vicious rip. She untangled it without a word, her hands steady. Wapiti pointed, a single, dark finger, ahead. Tucked into a hollow and nearly invisible against the dark earth was a long, low shack built of raw timber. A single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow from a dirty window. 2 men with rifles sat on crates near the door, smoking and talking in low voices. The boxcar, its number DB7 now unmistakable in their minds, sat on the siding 100 yards away. This shack was the holding pen. It was where the human cargo waited for its final shipment. A dry, racking cough echoed from within the walls, a sound of profound misery. The door was not just locked. It was barred from the outside with a heavy timber beam. Jonah's hands clenched into fists. The memory of Red Cliff, of kicking down a door and finding only terror and death, rose like bile in his throat. He felt the familiar, hot rush of anger, the urge to act, to charge in and end this now. But he forced it down. Certainty, he reminded himself. Not speed. He looked at Lila, her face pale in the faint moonlight, and the anger cooled to a cold, hard resolve. He would not fail her. He would not fail the people in that shack. The next part of the plan was Lila's, and it was the most dangerous, using her established reputation as a bookbinder. She was to go to the Vane warehouse the following afternoon. Her pretext was an offer to repair the spine of their main shipping ledger, which she knew from gossip was old and falling apart. The 2 copied pages from her own notebook were folded into a tiny, flat square, tucked into a secret pocket she had sewn into her sleeve. Her task was to insert them into the back of the ledger, a piece of irrefutable evidence that would forever live within Vane's own records. The warehouse office was surprisingly neat. It was Cully Finch's domain. He rose when Lila entered, a picture of polite efficiency. He wore a crisp shirt, spectacles, and a thin, welcoming smile. He was not a brute like Pike Crowder. He was something far more unnerving. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice smooth and educated.
What a pleasant surprise. To what do we owe the honor?
Lila explained her purpose, her voice betraying none of the frantic beating of her heart. She laid her tools on a small side table, her bone folder, her all. A pot of her own specially mixed glue. She felt his eyes on her, not admiring her skill, but calculating, weighing, searching. A commendable trade, bookbinding, he mused, watching as she examined the worn spine of the huge ledger, preserving the records, ensuring the stories do not fall apart. So much of our world depends on the integrity of the written word, does it not? Lila murmured her agreement. Focusing on the task, she carefully slit the old glue. peeling back the heavy leather cover. This was the moment. Her hand moved to her sleeve, her fingers closing around the small square of paper. It had to be fast. It had to be unseen. She worked the paper from her sleeve, shielding the movement with her body. But as she prepared to slip it into the cavity of the spine, Cully Finch leaned closer, an inquisitive look on his face.
"That is a fascinating aroma," he said, sniffing the air.
"Your glue. I presume it is different from what we use. Ours has a sharper, more vinegary scent. Yours is earthier, almost like walnuts." Lila froze. Her glue was indeed made with a walnut base, an old recipe of her father's. His was likely a cheaper, mass-produced iron gall formula. The difference was subtle, but to a man of details like Cully Finch, it was a discrepancy. It was a thread out of place. His eyes narrowed slightly, his polite mask slipping just enough for her to see the shrewd, suspicious mind working behind it. He was a breath away from discovery. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the afternoon air. Startlingly close, it was followed by the frantic fluttering and squawking of a pheasant taking flight from the brush just behind the warehouse. "What in thunder was that?" Cully exclaimed, straightening up and peering out the window. Another shot rang out. One of the guards from the loading dock shouted, "Poachers! He is heading for the creek!" The guard ran past the office window, his rifle in his hand. Cully, his curiosity piqued and his sense of order offended by the disruption, went to the doorway to watch. "Get him, you fool!" he yelled. "That is Vane's private land." In that moment of distraction, Lila's hands became a blur of motion. She slipped the folded pages deep into the spine, applied a swift line of her own glue, and pressed the leather cover back into place, holding it firm. By the time Cully turned back, his face flushed with irritation. She was calmly wiping excess glue from the seam with a cloth. "All done," she said, her voice a marvel of calm. "It will need to be pressed for a few hours to set properly, but it will hold for another 20 years. Cully gave her a distracted look, his mind still on the chase outside. "Very good. Miss Bennett, send your bill to my attention." Lila gathered her tools and left, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. As she rounded the corner of the building, she saw Jonah leaning against a fence post, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. No words were needed. It was their first true act of partnership, a silent dance of risk and trust executed across a field of dust and danger. But the land itself had its own plans for the day. As Lila and Jonah began the walk back to town, the wind began to shift. It no longer came in hot, lazy puffs, but in sharp, violent gusts that threw grit in their faces. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, began to take on a sickly yellow pallor. "Sandstorm," Jonah said, his voice tight. "It is coming fast." It hit them before they were halfway home. A solid wall of roaring, blinding dust. The world vanished. Visibility dropped to less than 5 feet. The sun was gone, replaced by a suffocating brown twilight. The wind howled, a physical force that pushed and tore at them. Lila pulled her shawl over her face, but the fine, stinging particles found their way into her eyes, her nose, her mouth. Jonah grabbed her hand. "Stay close," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar. But in the chaotic, swirling darkness, a sudden, violent gust ripped her from his grasp. She stumbled, fell to one knee, and when she got up, he was gone. Panic seized her. She called his name, but the wind snatched the word from her lips and tore it to shreds. She was alone, blind, in a world that had become a formless, hostile entity. She tried to walk, but she had no sense of direction. Every step could be taking her farther into the wilderness, away from the faint hope of the town. Time lost all meaning. She could have been walking for minutes or an hour. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Then, a shape loomed out of the swirling dust. A hand gripped her arm. Firm and sure, it was Jonah. He did not speak. He simply pulled her along, his body a shield against the worst of the wind. He seemed to navigate by instinct, a man who could read the land even when he could not see it. He led her to a small, abandoned stable she had not even known was there. He pushed the groaning door open, shoved her inside, and then forced it shut against the screaming wind. Inside, it was dark and blessedly still. The roar of the storm was muffled to a low moan. The air was thick with the scent of old hay and dry wood. Lila leaned against the rough wall, her body trembling, her lungs aching from the dust. Jonah moved past her in the darkness. She heard him fumbling, and then a match scraped, and the small, brave flame of a lantern illuminated their refuge. His face was caked with dirt, but his eyes were clear and calm. She was shivering, as much from the shock as the wind. Jonah took off his heavy canvas duster without a word and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was heavy, and it smelled of leather, dust, and him. It still held the warmth of his body. His hands brushed her shoulders as he settled it around her, a touch so brief it was barely there, yet it sent a current of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the coat. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the moaning of the wind outside the walls. Lila finally found her voice.
"Thank you. I was lost."
He looked at her, and a rare, faint smile touched the corners of his mouth, a slight shift in the stern lines of his face. "I am not good at talking, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice a low, rough comfort in the small, dark space. "I am just good at finding lost people." Lila pulled the heavy coat tighter around herself. In the West, she was learning. Intimacy was not something spoken in soft words. It was something shared. It was the weight of a coat in a storm. It was a silent, steady presence in the heart of chaos. It was a promise, not of safety, but of not having to face the storm alone. The sandstorm left the world raw and scoured. It passed as violently as it had arrived, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and a town coated in a fresh layer of fine, red dust in the quiet aftermath. Lila worked at her desk. The memory of the storm, a low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, the weight of Jonah's coat on her shoulders, the brief, steadying touch of his hand, these things lingered, impressions left on her soul like a watermark on fine paper. Her mind, trained to see patterns in columns of figures, was now sifting through the details of Silas Vane's operation. The 2 pages she had copied were a constant obsession. She studied them not just for the names, but for the very materials themselves. As a bookbinder, she knew ink. The entries made by Cully Finch, the lists of names and paltry sums advanced, were written in a standard, cheap gall ink, the kind that was common as dust in Ash Mesa. But the official-looking stamps, the ones that marked a contract fulfilled, were a different matter entirely. The ink was a deep, vibrant blue. It had a mineral sheen she recognized instantly. It was Prussian blue, an expensive pigment, one you had to order from a major supplier. The nearest one was in Santa Fe. The realization settled on her not with a shout, but with a cold, quiet certainty. The contracts, the ones that bound men to their fate in Dead Bride Gulch, were being faked. The basic agreements were likely written and signed here, under duress, using cheap local ink. But the official, legally binding stamps that sealed the deal were being applied elsewhere. Cully Finch was not just a bookkeeper, he was a forger. And the money trail, the real money from the silver mine, was flowing backward along that same route, disappearing into the ledgers of a company in Santa Fe. Silas Vane's scheme was not just a local tyranny. It was a sophisticated conspiracy designed to launder men into profits and profits into clean, untraceable assets. Her discovery was a dangerous piece of knowledge, and it isolated her even more. In the days that followed, she felt a change in the town's atmosphere. The initial shock over Ruby May's arrest had faded, replaced by a cautious, self-serving neutrality. Men who used to greet her with a friendly nod now seemed to find something interesting to look at on the other side of the street. Silas Vane was bringing the railroad to life, and the railroad meant money. No one wanted to stand too close to the woman who was quietly asking questions about the cost of that prosperity. Justice was an abstract concept. A full pocket was not. She saw Maud again a week later. It was dusk, and Lila was taking a shortcut through the alley behind the general store. Maud was there, half hidden in the shadows, as if waiting. Her fine silk dress looked out of place against the splintered wood and trash barrels. "I told you to be careful," Maud hissed, stepping in front of her. Her face was pale in the fading light. Her beauty stretched thin over a sharp unhappiness. "I am always careful," Lila replied. "You are a fool. You think you can fight him. He is not some drunken cowboy you can stare down. He is a king in this dusty little kingdom, and you are a fly. He will crush you, and he will not even notice he has done it." This was not the triumphant, cruel woman from the market. This was someone desperate, her voice frayed with a fear that was real. As she spoke, she gestured with a gloved hand, a sharp, angry motion. The fine leather of the glove caught on a nail protruding from the wall, pulling it partially down her wrist. In the brief moment before Maud could snatch her hand back, Lila saw it, a dark, ugly bruise, the color of a dying plum, circled her cousin's slender wrist. It was the mark of a hand that had gripped too hard, of a will that had been brutally enforced. Maud saw that she had seen. Her face crumpled for a second, a mask of pain and humiliation. "You think I am happy," she spat, the words a venomous whisper. "You think this silk and this house are a prize? They are a cage. Do not make the same mistake I did. Lila, do not think you can win. Just run." She pulled her glove back on, turned, and fled, leaving Lila standing alone in the alley, the scent of Maud's expensive perfume mingling with the smell of dust and decay. A seed of pity, small and bitter, began to sprout in the hard soil of Lila's heart. That night, old Wapiti found Jonah and Lila by the river, sitting on a fallen cottonwood. The old man said nothing for a long time, simply watching the water flow, dark and silent under the stars. "This river has seen much," he said finally, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Long ago, my people called this part of the water the Road of Bones."
"Why?" Lila asked softly.
"Because men with hungry spirits have always come here, first for beaver pelts, then for gold, now for the land itself. They take, and they think the river does not notice. But it does. The river always claims its due. The greedy ones, they build their houses on the sand, and they laugh at the sky. But the wind hears their laughter, and it tells the water. And one day, the water rises." His words were a prophecy, a reminder that there were older forms of justice than the kind written in law books. A little levity returned to their lives in the unlikely form of a lesson in saloon keeping, with business slower, and the patrons more wary. Ruby May took it upon herself to teach Lila how to work the bar. "You have to learn the art of the pour," Ruby May instructed, her tone mock serious. "The whiskey goes in the glass. Easy enough. The trick is getting it to the customer." She demonstrated, sliding a full glass down the polished wood of the bar to a waiting ranch hand. He caught it, his eyes lingering on Ruby May's hands. "See that you never let them touch you," she told Lila in a low voice. "Their hand is waiting for the glass, not for your fingers. You give them the drink, not your body. It is a fine line." Lila tried. Her first attempt sent the glass spinning off the bar, where it was caught with a laugh by the ranch hand. Her second attempt stopped a foot short. On the third try, she found the rhythm, a smooth, confident push that sent the glass gliding perfectly into the waiting hand. Ruby May clapped her on the shoulder. "There you go. You might make a bartender yet." Lila laughed. It was the first time in what felt like years. The sound was quiet, a little rusty, but it was genuine. It felt good. The laughter faded when she thought of the coming confrontation. The danger was a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of her daze. It was this fear that led Jonah to a decision. He found her at dusk, as she was closing the saloon's accounts. He was holding a pistol. It was a Colt Lightning, smaller and lighter than his own Peacemaker, with a graceful, bird's head grip. "I cannot always be there to shoot pheasants for you," he said, his voice even. "You need to be able to make your own noise if the time comes." He took her out to the bluffs behind the town as the last light bled from the sky. He set up a row of empty bottles on a rock. He placed the Colt in her hand. It was shockingly heavy, a cold, dense weight of deadly purpose. Her first shot went wide, the recoil jarring her arm from the shoulder to wrist. The second buried itself in the dirt 6 feet short of the target. Her hands were trembling. "You are fighting it," Jonah said, his voice calm and low at her shoulder. "Do not try to command it. Just guide it. Let the gun do the work. Breathe out when you squeeze." He moved behind her. He did not put his arms around her. He simply reached out and placed his large, steady hand over hers, his fingers curling over her own on the grip of the pistol. His other hand gently adjusted her stance. The warmth of his body was a solid presence at her back. His touch was not possessive. It was instructive. It was a transfer of stillness, of certainty, of his own quiet strength into her. "Breathe out," he repeated, his voice a low rasp near her ear. She did. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in their shared grip, but this time it felt controlled. Across the twilight, one of the bottles exploded in a starburst of glass. A slow smile spread across her face. She looked at Jonah, and he was already looking at her, his gray eyes catching the last of the light. The distance between them had collapsed. It had been replaced by a shared breath, the smell of gunpowder, and the silent understanding of a partnership forged in peril. She took her notebook out that night and wrote down the name of the boy they were hiding. His name, she had learned, was Wei. She stitched his name into the flyleaf with her red thread. The thread was no longer just a binder for paper. It was a line of connection, a promise to remember, a stitch holding together the names of the lost, a fragile testament against a world of lies written in disappearing ink. The storm was not made of sand this time. It came with water and a sky bruised the color of an old wound. Rain began to fall an hour after sunset, first as a whisper, then as a roar, drumming on the rooftops of Ash Mesa and turning the dust of the streets into a thick, sucking mud. It was the perfect cover. They met in the back room of the Silver Lark, a small knot of conspirators in the flickering lamplight. Jonah stood by the door, his face carved from shadow and resolve. Old Wapiti was a deeper shadow in the corner, his presence more felt than seen. Ruby May, her arms crossed, leaned against a stack of barrels, a shotgun resting beside her, and Lila, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, stood by the table, a map she had drawn from memory spread out before her. Wei, the small boy they were hiding, was safely asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the tempest gathering both outside and in the hearts of his protectors. The plan was as simple as it was desperate. Jonah and Wapiti would neutralize the 2 guards outside the holding shack. Lila, who had memorized the layout of the area, would guide them through the darkness and work the lock. Ruby May's part was to wait by the main road with a wagon and 2 horses. If they were discovered, she was to create a diversion, a runaway wagon, anything to draw attention away from the river. "Go now," Wapiti said, his voice a low rumble. "The rain is a good blanket." They moved out into the storm, 3 figures swallowed by the lashing rain and the night. The wind tore at them, and with every flash of lightning, the world was thrown into stark, monochrome relief, a landscape of skeletal trees and grasping shadows. Lila led the way. She was no longer just a bookbinder, a woman of paper and ink. In the past weeks, under Wapiti's quiet tutelage, she had learned a new language, the language of the land. A broken twig, a strangely shaped rock, a notch cut into the bark of a cottonwood. These were letters and words, a map that only the initiated could read. She moved with a newfound confidence, her feet finding purchase in the slick mud, her eyes reading the signs that the storm could not wash away. They reached the clearing by the river. The holding shack was a squat, ugly shape against the turbulent sky, its single lantern a bleary, jaundiced eye. The two guards were huddled on the porch, miserable and wet, their rifles leaning against the wall, from the larger, well-lit house that belonged to Silas Vane's foreman. They could hear the faint sound of a piano and raucous laughter. No one was paying attention to the human cargo in the shack. Wapiti moved away from them, silent as a hunting cat. He returned a few minutes later, his task complete. He had arranged a deadfall, a pile of loose rocks on the cliff edge above the path, held in place by a single tripwire. It was their only insurance. Jonah gave Lila a look. It was time. He and Wapiti split up, melting into the deeper shadows on either side of the porch. Lila took a deep breath, the cold, wet air stinging her lungs, and started across the open, muddy ground toward the shack. The Colt pistol Jonah had given her was a heavy, cold weight tucked into her belt, hidden beneath her cloak. She was halfway to the door when it happened. The door of the main house was thrown open, spilling a rectangle of yellow light into the yard. A figure was silhouetted there, massive and unmistakable. Pike Crowder. He had a bottle in one hand, and he was laughing. Then his laughter died. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, fixed on her. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then he moved, shockingly fast for a man his size. He charged across the yard, his boots sending up great splashes of mud. Jonah shouted her name, a raw, desperate sound. He could not shoot. She was directly in Pike's path. Pike slammed into her, his big hand tangling in her cloak, his other arm wrapping around her like a band of iron. He dragged her back into the center of the muddy yard. Holding her in front of him as a shield, his beery breath was hot and foul on her cheek. "Well, well, Sheriff," he roared, a triumphant grin splitting his face. "Look what the storm washed in. Come to do some reading. Little book mouse." Jonah stood in the shadows, his pistol drawn, his face a mask of cold fury. "Let her go, Pike." "I do not think so. I think the lady and I are going to have a long talk." He tightened his grip, his fingers digging cruelly into her arm. Lila struggled, but it was like fighting a bear. She could feel the panic rising, a cold tide that threatened to drown her. Then she remembered Jonah's words, his hand over hers on the pistol. "Do not fight it. Guide it." She stopped struggling. She went still. And in that moment of stillness, a raw, primal instinct took over. She turned her head and sank her teeth into the fleshy part of his wrist, the one holding her cloak. She bit down with all the force of her fear and her fury. He screamed, a high, surprised sound, and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She wrenched herself away, stumbling backward and falling into the slick, cold mud. At that exact moment, something arced through the air from the second-story window of the house. It glinted in the lantern light. A small, dark object that landed with a soft squelch in the mud near her. A key. Lila looked up. In the window, for just a second, she saw a face, pale and terrified. It was Maud. Their eyes met across the rain-swept darkness. No words were spoken. None were needed. It was an apology, a plea, and an act of rebellion all in one. The moment was shattered by the crack of a rifle. One of the guards on the porch had recovered his senses. Jonah fired back, and the guard crumpled. The other guard fired wildly into the darkness. A bullet whined past Lila's ear. Another tore a hot furrow along old Wapiti's arm, and the old man grunted in pain. Jonah did not hesitate. He grabbed Wapiti, hauling him back toward the cover of the trees. Lila, scrambling in the mud, snatched the key. She ignored Pike, who was cursing and clutching his bleeding wrist, and ran for the shack. The key slid into the heavy padlock. It turned, She threw the bar and wrenched the door open. "Come on!" she screamed at the terrified faces within. "Now!" They emerged, blinking in the unsteady light. A small, ragged group of souls. 2 Mexican miners, their faces gaunt with hunger. A young Cheyenne woman whose eyes were wide with a silent, profound terror. And at the back, little Wei, who ran to Lila and clung to her legs. Another shot from the main house kicked up a spray of mud beside her. Jonah and a wounded Wapiti were laying down covering fire, giving them a chance. "We have to go to the river," Lila shouted. She herded her small, stumbling flock toward the dark line of trees. Pike was on his feet again, roaring with rage, firing his pistol blindly into the night. Lila turned, drew the Colt, her hand surprisingly steady. She remembered Jonah's voice, the feel of his hand over hers. "Breathe out." She fired. The shot went wide, but the muzzle flash made Pike duck. She fired again. The bullet clipped the wooden post next to his head, sending splinters flying into his face. It was enough. He staggered back, giving them the seconds they needed. They plunged into the darkness of the trees, making for the river. The escape was a nightmare of tangled roots, whipping branches, and sucking mud. They reached the riverbank and did not slow down. The water was a raging black torrent, swollen by the storm. It was shockingly, brutally cold. The current tugged at their legs, trying to pull them under. A strand of barbed wire, washed down from a broken fence, snagged Lila's skirt, pulling her off her feet. The cold water closed over her head. She came up sputtering, tangled and terrified. Jonah, who had already carried Wei to the other side, plunged back in. He tore her skirt free from the wire and half-carried, half-dragged her to the opposite bank. She looked back and saw the Cheyenne woman flailing in the middle of the river, her strength gone. Without a thought, Lila pushed away from Jonah and fought her way back into the current, grabbing the woman's arm and pulling her toward the safety of the bank. They collapsed on the far side, a sodden, shivering, exhausted heap of humanity. They were free, but they were not safe. They could hear shouting from the other side of the river, the sounds of an organized pursuit. They scrambled along the bank until they found a small, rickety wooden bridge used for farm crossings. They huddled in the deep, dark space beneath it, out of the driving rain. Hidden from view, the roar of the storm and the river was a deafening chaos all around them. Lila was shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline gone, leaving only a deep, bone-numbing cold and the aftershock of terror. She hugged her arms to her chest, but she could not get warm. Then she felt a solid warmth behind her. Jonah had moved, pressing his back to hers, his shoulders shielding her from the wind that whipped under the bridge. He was a solid, living wall, and his heat began to seep into her, a slow, life-giving warmth. He leaned his head close to hers, his voice a low, rough whisper that was nearly lost in the storm. "You are not alone anymore," he said. The words were simple. They were not a declaration of love, not a promise of a future. They were a statement of fact, a truth forged in that single, violent night, in the heart of the tempest, huddled in the darkness with a small group of rescued souls. Lila Bennett knew he was right. She closed her eyes, leaned back into the steady strength of the man behind her, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not alone. They had escaped, but she knew Silas Vane would not see this as a rescue. He would see it as a theft. He had been robbed of his property, and his pride. His response, she knew, would be as merciless and as destructive as the storm that now raged above their heads. The ashes were still warm when dawn broke. Silas Vane's counterattack was not long in coming. Before the sun was fully clear of the horizon, a column of thick, black smoke was climbing into the clean morning sky. The depot warehouse was on fire. By the time any organized bucket brigade could be formed, it was too late. The old wooden structure, filled with dry goods and tinder-dry paperwork, went up like a torch, collapsing into a roaring pyre that consumed everything within it, including, everyone assumed, the original copies of Vane's labor contracts. Silas Vane stood among the onlookers, his face a mask of civic concern, accepting condolences for his loss. An unfortunate accident, he called it a stray spark from a passing locomotive, most likely. Jonah stood on the other side of the street, his face grim, saying nothing. He and everyone else knew it was no accident. It was the act of a man erasing his own crimes with fire, a scorched earth retreat. The mood in Ash Mesa, which had been simmering with a nervous tension, now cooled into a resigned fear. Vane had demonstrated his reach. He could burn a building in the center of town and call it an accident, and no one would dare contradict him. The brief flicker of hope that had ignited in the church now seemed in danger of being extinguished. It was Cully Finch who brought the gloating directly to Lila. He found her in the Silver Lark, where she was serving coffee to the few somber patrons. He did not order a drink. He simply stood before her desk, his hands clasped behind his back, a look of polite, academic pity on his face.
"A terrible tragedy. The fire," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "All those records, all that history, gone to smoke. It just goes to show you, Miss Bennett, paper is a fragile medium for the truth. When the paper burns, so does the truth." He smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of his lips. He believed he had won. He believed the physical evidence was gone, leaving only the word of a few vagrants and a bookish woman against the most powerful man in the territory. Lila looked up at him from her chair. She did not raise her voice. She did not show any anger. She simply reached into a drawer of her desk and pulled out a portfolio made of 2 stiff pieces of binder's board. She opened it. Inside, protected by sheets of oilcloth, were 6 sheets of thick, fibrous blotting paper. She laid one on the desk for him to see. It was a faint, ghostly image, a reverse impression of the cover of one of Vane's contracts, but the details were unmistakable. And the seal, the official stamp, had been transferred in a clear, distinct shade of Prussian blue. "I know about the ink. Cully," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the cold weight of iron. "I know you order it from Santa Fe. I know these contracts were not finalized here. I know you are a forger. And now, so will a federal judge." The color drained from Cully Finch's face. His polite mask dissolved, revealing the cornered, calculating rat beneath. He stared at the blotter paper, at the undeniable chemical ghost of his crime. And for the first time, Lila saw fear in his eyes. He turned without another word and walked quickly from the saloon. The victory was short-lived. It was followed by a new, more personal horror. That evening, a young Mexican girl who worked as a maid in the Vane household came scratching at the back door of the Silver Lark, her eyes wide with terror. She spoke in a torrent of panicked Spanish. Ruby May translated, her face growing paler with every word. Pike Crowder had come to the house. He had argued with Mrs. Vane. He had dragged her out, forcing her into a carriage. He had called her a traitor. He had said Silas wanted to have a long talk with her. Somewhere she could not be heard. They had ridden out of town, heading north, toward the Badlands. The news landed like a punch to Lila's gut. Maud, the woman who had publicly flayed her with words, who had mocked her loneliness and her grief, but also the woman who had stood in a window and thrown a key into the mud, the woman with the bruised wrist and the caged, desperate eyes. An argument erupted in the back room of the saloon. "We cannot risk it," Ruby May insisted, her voice sharp with pragmatism. "We have the minors, the woman, the boy. They are our responsibility. We cannot go chasing after the snake's wife." She made her bed. Jonah was silent, his face a thundercloud. The ghost of Red Cliff was in the room with them, a cold presence only he could see. He was thinking of charging into another situation, guns blazing, another rescue that could turn into a massacre. His hands were clenched at his sides. Lila's mind was a battlefield. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to agree with Ruby May.
Maud had wished her ill. Protecting the people they had already saved was the logical, sensible thing to do. But she could not erase the image of Maud's face in the window, or the dark, ugly bruise on her wrist. To leave her to the mercy of Pike Crowder and Silas Vane was not justice. It was a cold, calculated abandonment that felt almost as dirty as Vane's own crimes. "I have to go," Lila said, the words surprising her as much as anyone else. "We have to go. We do not leave people behind, not even her." Jonah looked at her, his internal struggle visible in the tight lines around his eyes. He was hesitating, caught between his duty and his fear of repeating his worst failure. It was Reverend Santos who broke the deadlock. She had come to the saloon as soon as she heard the news, a small, solid figure of unshakable faith. She walked over to Jonah and placed a gentle hand on his tense arm. "Sheriff," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Saving a person is not the same as shooting blindly. It is an act of deliberate grace. You are not that man from Red Cliff anymore. Do not let his ghost make your decisions for you." Jonah looked down at her, and something in his expression seemed to unclench. He took a deep, steadying breath, and the ghost retreated. He was the sheriff of Ash Mesa again. The tension in the room was still thick enough to taste. It was Ruby May, of all people. Who broke it? She disappeared for a moment and came back holding a brand new, clean felt hat. She walked up to Jonah and unceremoniously took the dusty, battered hat from his head and replaced it with the new one. "There," she said with a grim smile. "Maybe a new face will help you reclaim your old honor. Besides, that other one had a bullet hole in it. It was bad for your image." A small, surprised chuckle escaped Lila's lips. It was a fragile sound in the face of so much danger, but it was real. Jonah touched the brim of the new hat, a faint, wry smile touching his own lips. The moment of shared gallows humor was a small release, a brief breath of fresh air that cleared the way for what had to be done. "We cannot go after them directly," Jonah said, his voice once again calm and authoritative. "They will be expecting that. We have to be smarter. We have to use their own tools against them." The plan came together quickly, a desperate piece of strategic theater. Cully Finch, under pressure, had revealed the location of the private telegraph key Vane used for his sensitive communications. They would send a message, one that looked like it came from Vane's contact in Santa Fe, a message warning of a federal marshal on his way to Ash Mesa, a message urging Vane and his key enforcer, Pike, to meet a paid informant immediately. And the meeting place Lila suggested, her mind racing. Somewhere the land itself can confuse them. "Widow's Notch," Jonah said, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. A narrow canyon north of town, famous for its treacherous acoustics. A single gunshot could sound like it was coming from 3 different directions at once. An echo in that place could be a weapon. A lie, amplified by the rocks themselves, could be used to trap the liar. It was a plan built on deception and a deep knowledge of the country. They were no longer just reacting to Silas Vane, they were setting their own trap. The thong of the legal noose was tightening, but the rope of frontier justice would have to be pulled first, in a place where the only witnesses would be the wind and the stone. The sky over Widow's Notch had turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind, funneled between the 2 towering walls of red rock, did not just blow, it howled, a high, mournful sound like a chorus of grieving women. Then the hail began. It was not rain, but a hard, stinging volley of ice, as if the heavens themselves had taken up arms. Nature, it seemed, was choosing a side. Silas Vane and Pike Crowder rode into the mouth of the canyon, their faces tight with a mixture of greed and paranoia. The fake telegraph message had worked perfectly, preying on their fear of federal interference. They believed they were meeting a paid informant who could identify the marshal supposedly on his way from Santa Fe. A single rifle shot cracked from the cliffs above. The sound was a physical blow, striking the rock walls and shattering into a dozen echoes. It was impossible to tell where it had come from. A second shot ricocheted off a boulder a few feet to their left, the sound seeming to come from the right. "It is a trap," Pike roared, pulling his horse around. "Jonah is up there," Vane snarled, his eyes scanning the rimrock. "He is trying to herd us. You, go left. Flush him out. I will take the main canyon. He cannot be in two places at once." It was the arrogance of a man who believed himself a king. He did not understand that in this place. A single man could sound like an army. Pike spurred his horse up a side trail, while Vane galloped deeper into the notch, his pistol drawn. Jonah watched them split up, his face as hard and unforgiving as the stone around him. He fired again, a carefully placed shot that struck the canyon wall far behind Vane, creating another ghost echo that seemed to pursue him, driving him deeper into the box canyon at the notch's end, while the deadly game of sound and fury played out below. Lila was moving along a high, narrow goat trail that wound around the back of the western cliff. The hail stung her face and hands, and the wind threatened to tear her from her precarious footing. She found the small cave, little more than a hollowed-out space in the rock, where Pike had left Maud. Her cousin was bound and gagged, her fine dress torn and muddy. Her eyes, when they saw Lila, were wide with a terrified, desperate hope. Lila worked at the rough knots, her fingers numb with cold. As she pulled the gag from Maud's mouth, the sound of gunfire from the canyon below grew more intense.
"He is going to kill him,"
Maud whispered, her voice hoarse.
"Silas, he will kill the sheriff."
"Not if we stop him," Lila said, helping her to her feet. They had just stepped out of the cave when Pike Crowder appeared on the trail below them, leading his horse. He had circled back, realizing he had been duped. He looked up, and a slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Look what I found. 2 birds, 1 stone," he sneered at Lila. "I told you to stop reading other people's books, little mouse." Lila pushed Maud behind her. She drew the Colt pistol, her hand cold but steady. Books hold memories. "Pike, that is more than can be said for men like you." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound.
"You going to shoot me with that thing? You do not have the sand."
He reached for his own pistol. Lila did not aim for his chest. She aimed for the thick leather strap of his gun belt. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafeningly loud on the narrow ledge. The bullet tore through the leather, and Pike's heavy pistol and holster clattered to the rocks at his feet. He stared at his empty hip in disbelief, then lunged for her, his face a mask of fury. She did not have time to fire again. She sidestepped his clumsy charge and brought the heavy barrel of the Colt down on the side of his head with all her strength. He grunted and staggered, his eyes glazing over, before he crumpled to the ground in an unconscious heap. Down in the canyon, Jonah had run out of tricks. He was in the dead end, and Silas Vane was advancing on him, using a series of massive boulders for cover. A bullet from Vane's rifle kicked up a spray of rock fragments that stung Jonah's cheek. He was pinned down. Then, from high above, came a small, desperate cry. It was Way, the boy, along with the other rescued workers, had been brought by the Reverend and Ruby May along a hidden path old Wapiti had shown them. He had seen the sheriff in danger. He picked up a rock, a child's weapon, and threw it with all his might. The rock was small, but the throw was true. It struck Silas Vane on the forehead, not hard enough to do serious damage, but enough to startle him, to make him flinch and cry out in surprise. In that instant of distraction, he exposed himself from behind the boulder. Jonah fired, but Vane fired a fraction of a second sooner. A searing, white-hot pain tore through Jonah's left arm. The impact spun him around, and he fell to one knee, his arm suddenly useless. Vane laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. He stepped out from behind the boulder, leveling his rifle for the killing shot. It was then that Maud appeared, scrambling down a rock slide, her face wild with terror and a newfound courage. "No!" she screamed, and threw herself at her husband. She was no match for his strength. He backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling to the ground. But she had bought Jonah a precious second.
You can only buy fear.
"Silas!" she shrieked from the ground, her voice filled with a terrible, liberating truth.
You cannot buy silence anymore.
The canyon was suddenly, shockingly, full of people. Reverend Santos and Ruby May appeared at the mouth of the side trail, their faces grim. The two Mexican miners stood beside them, their hands holding not guns, but heavy rocks, their expressions a silent, simmering rage. From the main entrance to the canyon, old Wapiti emerged, his rifle held steady. Beside him, looking pale and terrified, but walking upright, was Cully Finch. Wapiti was carrying Cully's satchel, the one containing the forged contracts and the keys to the cash boxes. The trap had closed. Silas Vane looked around, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was surrounded, not by lawmen, but by his victims. He raised his rifle again, his eyes fixed on the wounded Jonah. It was his last mistake. Jonah, fighting through a wave of pain and dizziness, raised his own pistol with his good right hand. He was on one knee, a wounded lawman who had every reason and every right to end the life of the man who had terrorized his town. The ghost of Red Cliff whispered in his ear, a siren song of swift, deadly vengeance. He ignored it. He took a steadying breath. His aim was calm, precise, and legal. He did not aim for Silas Vane's heart. He aimed for his hand. The shot was a clean, sharp crack. Vane's rifle flew from his grasp, clattering onto the rocks. He stared at his shattered hand, his face a perfect picture of agony and defeat. It was over, not with a killing, but with the cold, impartial disarming of the law. As if on cue, a brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, striking a dead ancient pine tree perched on the canyon rim. With a sound like a cannon shot, the massive tree fell, crashing down to block the canyon's main entrance, cutting off any hope of escape for the few Vane henchmen who had followed him. The land itself had passed judgment. The hail stopped. The wind died down to a low whisper. In the sudden, ringing silence, Lila ran to Jonah's side. She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat, her hands shaking, but her movements sure and steady. She pressed it against the bleeding wound on his arm, her touch gentle. He looked up at her, his face pale with pain, his gray eyes filled with a deep, quiet light she had never seen before. "I owe you," he whispered, his voice a rough rasp. She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "No," he corrected himself, his good hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. "We owe each other a decent life." In the quiet aftermath of the battle, surrounded by the wreckage of Silas Vane's ambition, the words hung in the clean, rain-washed air. They were more than a thank you, more than an admission. They were a promise, stitched together not with red thread, but with shared peril and a hard-won, silent understanding. The justice that came to Ash Mesa was not swift, but it was thorough. The county seat, a 2-day ride away, became the stage for the final act of Silas Vane's reign. The trial was a quiet, methodical affair, a stark contrast to the storm and fury of Widow's Notch. The evidence was laid out piece by piece, an irrefutable narrative of greed. Lila's copied pages, the ghostly blue images on the blotter paper, the captured telegraph messages, and Cully Finch's own satchel of incriminating documents formed a cage of paper and ink from which there was no escape. The human evidence was even more powerful. The two Mexican miners, their faces still gaunt but their eyes steady, told their stories through an interpreter. The Cheyenne woman spoke in her own language, her quiet words translated into a harrowing tale of abduction and despair. But the testimony that silenced the courtroom came from Maud Vane. She took the stand not in silk and feathers, but in a simple gray dress that made her look younger and tragically fragile. She did not weep or raise her voice. She spoke with a chilling, factual calm, describing a marriage that was not a union of hearts, but a contract of fear. She detailed Silas's threats, his rages, the casual cruelty that had left bruises on both her body and her soul. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room. It was the sound of a truth finally given air to breathe. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Silas Vane and Cully Finch were sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Pike Crowder, for his part in the abductions, was sentenced to a life of hard labor, a fitting irony for a man who had profited from the forced servitude of others. Maud, in light of her testimony and the clear evidence of her own suffering, received a lenient sentence, 2 years of community labor, to be served under the supervision of the one person in Ash Mesa who would ensure it was an act of penitence and not just punishment, Reverend Mercy Santos. The town of Ash Mesa began to heal. The first act of this new chapter was not one of vengeance, but of restoration. In the church, with the rescued workers sitting in the front pew, the Reverend, Ruby May, and Lila established the Railroad Benevolent Fund. Its purpose was simple: to use the assets seized from Vane's illegal enterprise to give his victims a choice. They could receive passage back to their homes, whether in Mexico or across the sea in China, or they could be given a stake to start a new, honest life in Ash Mesa. Most chose to stay. For Jonah Hale, the end of the trial brought a quiet kind of peace he had not known for years. The townsfolk looked at him differently now. The whispers about the fast gun from Red Cliff had faded, replaced by a quiet, steady respect for the man who had brought justice not with a volley of bullets, but with patience and a respect for the law. He was no longer a man haunted by a ghost. By refusing to kill Silas Vane when he had the chance, by choosing the law over vengeance, he had finally laid the ghost of Red Cliff to rest. One quiet afternoon, he came into the Silver Lark when it was empty. Lila was at her corner desk, re-sewing the spine on an old Bible. He watched her for a moment, the rhythmic, precise movement of her hands, the way the red thread pulled the pages together. "Show me," he said, his voice a low rasp. She looked up, surprised. He gestured to the tools, the leather, the needle. She slid over on the bench, making room for him. She tried to teach him the simple act of piercing the pages with an awl, of passing the needle and thread through in a kettle stitch. His hands, so steady and certain with a pistol, were clumsy and unsure with the delicate tools. His stitches were uneven, his knots bulky. Lila smiled, a genuine, teasing light in her eyes. "Sheriff," she said, her voice soft, "the red thread does not obey orders. You have to persuade it." He looked up from his fumbled work, not at the book, but at her. His gray eyes were serious, but a faint, wry smile touched his lips. "Neither do I. Not when I am talking to you." The air in the quiet saloon shifted, became charged with the unspoken words that lay between them. The moment was warm, intimate, and more real than any flowery declaration. But later that night, alone in her room, a cold fear crept back into Lila's heart. She remembered the day a different kind of promise had been broken. The day the telegram had arrived telling her of the dynamite explosion that had taken Thomas. Love, for her, was inextricably linked with a sudden, violent loss. To open her heart to this quiet, steady man felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. She was afraid that if she let herself fall, the landing would once again be nothing but wreckage and dust. Jonah seemed to understand her fear without her having to speak it. He did not press her, did not fill the silences with easy promises. He simply gave her his steady, quiet presence. 2 weeks after the trial, he came to her again as she was working late. He was holding a small box in his hand. It was crudely made. The binder's board slightly uneven. The covering of plain brown leather stitched together with a clumsy, halting seam of red thread. It was clearly his own work. He held it out to her. He did not say a word, just waited. She took the box, her fingers tracing the uneven stitches. Inside, resting on a small piece of folded velvet, was a ring. It was not fancy. It was a simple, unadorned band of silver, hammered into a circle. its surface showing the faint marks of the tool that had shaped it. It was as honest and as unpretentious as the man who was offering it. Lila looked up at him, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and her old, familiar fear. "I am not asking you for an answer," Jonah said, his voice a low, gentle rasp. "I see the shadow in your eyes. Lila, I know you are afraid, so I will wait." He took a breath, his gaze holding hers. "I will wait for as long as it takes, not because I'm afraid, but because I respect the woman who has to make the choice." He placed his hand over hers, his fingers warm and steady on the clumsy box. The gesture was not a demand. It was a promise of patience. Life in the Silver Lark settled into a new, more hopeful rhythm. Wei, the small boy Lila had found under the boxcar, had become a permanent and beloved fixture. He was bright and quick, and he was teaching the whole town a few words of Cantonese. One evening, he was very seriously trying to teach Jonah how to say his name correctly. "Wei," the boy said, pronouncing it with a clear, bell-like tone. "We," Jonah repeated, his deeper voice mangling the sound. The boy giggled. "No, Wei." Wei, Jonah tried again, a look of profound concentration on his face. The boy dissolved into a fit of laughter, and soon the entire saloon joined in. It was not mocking laughter. It was a warm, communal sound, the sound of a group of disparate, wounded people who were slowly, haltingly, becoming a family. Jonah took the teasing in good stride, ruffling the boy's hair and laughing along with them. Later that night, Lila sat in her room, the small, handmade box on the table in front of her. She did not open it. She just looked at the clumsy red stitches that held it together. It was not the symbol of a grand passion. It was the symbol of something quieter, deeper, and far more rare. It was the symbol of a love that was willing to wait. A love that was being built not with pretty words, but with shared deeds, quiet understanding, and the slow, patient work of two hands learning to stitch a new life together. The spring of 1887 arrived in Ash Mesa not as a sudden guest, but as a slow, returning friend. The wind still blew from the high red rock, but it seemed to have lost some of its sharp, cutting edge. It carried the scent of new grass and damp earth, a promise of renewal that felt earned. The town itself had changed. The raw, desperate energy of the railroad boom had settled into the quieter rhythm of a community putting down roots. On a large board outside the new depot, a set of fair labor practices, drafted by Reverend Santos and ratified by the railroad company under federal pressure, was posted for all to see. The words were a quiet monument to a fight that had been won not with guns, but with courage and ink. Inside the Silver Lark, a new picture hung on the wall behind the bar. It was a formal photograph, taken by a traveling photographer, of a strange and wonderful collection of people. In the center sat the two Mexican miners and the Cheyenne woman, their faces no longer haunted but filled with a quiet dignity. Standing behind them were Ruby May, Reverend Santos, Old Wapiti, Jonah, and Lila. And at their feet, sitting cross-legged and grinning, was a small Chinese boy named Wei. Ruby May called it the portrait of the people who got their names back. Lila no longer kept her accounts at a small corner desk. A few doors down from the saloon, a new sign hung, its letters painted in a clear, steady hand. It read, "The Red Thread Bindery." The space was small, but it was hers. It smelled of leather, glue, and the infinite, hopeful promise of paper. It was more than a shop. It was becoming the town's heart. In the afternoons, a small clutch of children would gather at her feet as she read to them from books she had mended. In the evenings, she held a quiet class for the ranch hands and railroad workers who had never learned to write their own names, their large, calloused hands struggling to form the delicate shapes of letters. She was no longer just mending books. She was mending the gaps in people's lives. Jonah was a constant, quiet presence in this new life. He would often stop by at the end of his day, his arm now fully healed, leaving only a pale, thin scar as a reminder of the violence that had brought them together. He would sit and listen to the stories, his gray eyes watching her with a steady, unwavering light. The silver ring remained in the clumsy, red-stitched box in her room. He never mentioned it. He simply waited, giving her the gift of time, allowing her to heal the old wound that Thomas's death had left behind. A wound she had not even realized was still bleeding until Jonah's quiet patience began to stitch it closed. The morning she made her decision, the sky was a pale, clear lavender, the kind that promises a fine day. She woke before the sun, a sense of quiet clarity settling over her like a warm blanket. The fear was gone. In its place was a calm, steady certainty. She met Jonah as he was beginning his morning rounds. She did not say a word, just took his hand and led him out of town, to the line of barbed wire fence that marked the edge of the prairie. The wind was humming its low, mournful song on the wires. But this morning, in the cool, pre-dawn air, it sounded less like a lament and more like the strumming of a strange, vast instrument. They stood there for a long time, watching the eastern horizon begin to glow. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything they had been through together, a shared history of risk and trust. Jonah was the one who finally spoke. He turned to face her, his features softened by the gentle, gray light. "All my life," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, "I have kept quiet. I figured if I did not say much, I could not say the wrong thing. It seemed safer." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But with you, Lila, being quiet is the wrong thing. It is the biggest mistake I could make." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, handmade box. He opened it. The simple silver band seemed to catch and hold the first, faint rays of the rising sun. Lila looked from the ring to his face, and she saw her future there, as clear and as certain as the coming day. She smiled, a slow, warm curve of her lips. "If we are to be married, Sheriff," she said, her voice full of a gentle, teasing warmth, "you must know there are conditions." A flicker of surprise, and then amusement, showed in his eyes. "Conditions?" "Yes. First, you will be required to make the coffee every morning, and it must be strong enough to stand a spoon in." He considered this with mock gravity. "I believe I can meet that term." "And second," she continued, her smile widening, "you must practice your bookbinding. I cannot have a husband who sews a crooked seam." Jonah Hale threw back his head and laughed. It was a sound she had never heard before, a full, rich sound of pure, unburdened joy that seemed to startle the birds from the sagebrush. "I swear it," he said, his eyes shining as he took her hand. "I swear it on this barbed wire." From a distance, standing near the church, a lone figure watched them. It was Maud. She was on her way to begin her morning's work, sweeping the church steps. She saw Jonah take Lila into his arms. She saw the glint of the ring as he slid it onto Lila's finger. A complex mixture of regret and a faint, surprising flicker of peace passed over her face. "I was wrong," she whispered to the empty street. In Jonah's arms. Lila looked past his shoulder at the vast, awakening prairie. She thought of her cousin's cruel words, spoken so long ago in the crowded market. "You will never find love again." She smiled against Jonah's chest. "You do not find love," she thought. "It is not something you can hunt for. It finds you when you are too busy living a decent life to notice it is there." The sun was fully up now, a brilliant disk of orange and gold, flooding the world with light. It illuminated the barbed wire fence, transforming the sharp, cruel barbs into a string of glittering jewels. The red thread on the small, discarded ring box glowed like a single, perfect drop of blood, a symbol of the bond that had been stitched, one perilous, honest act at a time, between two lonely souls. Later that day, Lila hung a new, small sign in the window of her shop. Jonah stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his presence as solid and as real as the ground beneath her feet. The sign was simple, her handwriting clear and strong. It read, "Books mended, so are lives." He took her hand in his, their fingers lacing together, a comfortable, perfect fit, as the morning sun warmed their faces. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.